Hey everyone, before we begin, remember to hit the notification bell and turn on all the notifications. Also, don't forget to drop a quick comment saying where you're listening from, or just say that you're doing your part. On February 10th, 1998, a maintenance worker at the Spanish Gates apartment complex in Glendale, Colorado, noticed a foul odor coming from what should have been an empty unit. Upon investigating, the worker found the decomposing body of a young adult male on the floor. Police were alerted and arrived to a grim scene. The deceased man lay surrounded by large amounts of cash and various substances strewn about the apartment. Investigators determined he had been dead for approximately 3 days by the time he was found. There were no signs of foul play at the scene. Instead, the evidence pointed to a fatal overdose. An autopsy later confirmed extremely high levels of heroin in his system, confirming that he likely accidentally administered too much of the substance to himself. Shockingly, as investigators secured the scene, an incident occurred that briefly stole headlines. A Glendale police officer who responded that day was caught attempting to steal some of the cash found with the body. According to contemporaneous reports, another officer saw him trying to pocket the money, and he was arrested and charged with the theft. Detectives soon realized the unidentified man had been living under multiple false identities. In the apartment, they found several forms of identification, including a Texas state ID card in the name Diego Perez. At first glance, it looked like a legitimate driver's license, and in fact, it was an authentic ID issued by Texas authorities, but the credentials used to obtain it were stolen. The address on that card, 501 East 8th Street in Austin, Texas, turned out to be a homeless shelter formerly run by the Salvation Army. This suggested that Diego Perez was an assumed identity, likely using a real person's information that the John Doe had fraudulently adopted. In his pockets were additional fake IDs and documents with other names. Investigators soon uncovered at least 5 aliases tied to the same man. He had gone by Julio Costalazo, Pablo Marquez Soto, Salvatore Franco, James Edgar, and Armando Aguilar Franco, in addition to the name Diego Perez. Personally, I like that he tossed James Edgar in there just to mix it up a bit, but I'll be coming back to that. It was clear that the man had gone to great lengths to obscure who he really was. Digging deeper, authorities checked law enforcement and immigration databases and were astonished by what they found. The John Doe had a history of encounters with U.S. officials under those assumed names. In fact, multiple Immigration and Naturalization Service records were linked to him, each under a different alias. He had been assigned at least 2 separate alien registration numbers during prior run-ins with immigration authorities. One record showed him detained under the name Franco as far back as May 7, 1986 in Spokane, Washington. Another record under Julio Costalazo was also found. These records came with photographs, meaning the government had captured his image on multiple occasions throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The fact that he had brushes with law enforcement and deportation proceedings suggests he may have been involved in illicit activities. Ironically, despite these extensive records and fake identities, authorities couldn't find any trace of his real identity. No fingerprints in national databases matched a known missing person, and every name he used was a dead end. One unusual advantage investigators have in this case is the abundance of photographs of the John Doe while alive. Typically, unidentified persons are known only by reconstructions or gruesome post-mortem images, but this case is different. Because the Doe had been arrested, detained, or otherwise documented multiple times under his aliases, authorities possess nearly a dozen photographs of him from those incidents. These images include mugshots and identification photos taken over the years. In some photos, he wears eyeglasses, and indeed a pair of glasses was found with his belongings when he died. The photos show a Hispanic male with thick, curly black hair and brown eyes. Notably, some have speculated that he may be Afro-Latino based on his appearance, while others have questioned whether he was actually of Hispanic origin at all. After all, he was a chameleon, and what better way to hide his true identity than by further obscuring his true origins? Some have suggested the James Edgar alias is evidence that he may actually have been of African American or a mixed race background, adopting these other aliases as additional cover. Unfortunately, for the reasons I'm about to delve into, it's unlikely that we will ever have a definitive answer. The investigation into Diego Perez's true identity has faced several challenges. A major hurdle is the lack of preserved forensic evidence for modern DNA analysis. Unfortunately, back in 1998, after the autopsy was completed, the man's remains were cremated. At the time, this may have been a routine decision for an unclaimed body, especially one whose cause of death wasn't disputed. However, it has since proved to be a regrettable choice. With the body cremated and thus effectively destroyed, no DNA sample or dental records could be saved for future testing. Unless someone recognizes one of the numerous pictures of this man, it's likely that he will be forever a complete unknown. For over a week, a frightened man in Florida carried the weight of a terrible secret. He had seen a young woman brutally slain in a remote sugarcane field outside Belle Glade, and her desperate last pleas still echoed in his mind. Hiding among the tall stalks, the anonymous hunter watched as two men argued with the woman by a blue Ford Bronco. She begged a man she called Ricardito for mercy, but the confrontation turned fatal when he struck her repeatedly with a machete. Afterwards, the horrified witness saw the attackers drag the woman's body deeper into the cane field and drive away. He caught only a glimpse of the Bronco's license plate containing the numbers 7 and 2. Fearing for his own life and aware that he'd been trespassing to hunt, the witness, who gave the name Antonio, waited more than a week before finally calling the authorities. Antonio's delayed call, made nervously in Spanish to a Miami emergency dispatcher, provided just enough clues for authorities to begin their investigation. He directed police to a landmark near the crime scene, a building shaped like an ice cream cone in the Belle Glade area. Palm Beach County detectives recognized this description as the local Twisty Treat ice cream stand, and they rushed to search the fields behind it. There, just as Antonio had described, detectives discovered the remains of a female victim concealed in the tall grass about a mile south of the shop. Finding the body was only the beginning of a difficult investigation. The victim's remains were badly decomposed, indicating she had been lying out in the Florida heat for roughly a week or more. The attack had been vicious. An autopsy determined the woman died from multiple deep-cutting wounds consistent with a machete, reflecting a horrifying level of brutality. Because of advanced decomposition, the corpse was already transitioning into a mummified state. Identifying the victim was a challenge. Most of her fingers had skeletonized, but detectives managed to obtain one viable thumbprint from her right hand. Incredibly, that single thumbprint was enough to confirm the victim's identity as Rebecca Young, a local young woman who had been reported missing in Belle Glade. Rebecca Young was just 21 years old at the time of her death and a longtime resident of the Belle Glade community. In a cruel twist of fate, investigators learned that violence had already touched Rebecca's life years before. When Rebecca was only 12, her own mother had been slain, an event that left deep scars on Rebecca. After that tragedy, Rebecca was raised by her aunt, Lucille Williams, with whom she shared a close bond. As detectives dug into Rebecca's background for clues, they uncovered signs that her life had taken a difficult turn in the years leading up to her slaying. After high school, Rebecca became involved with an older man known around town as a petty criminal. This man, whose sources called her quote-unquote boyfriend, drew Rebecca into a dangerous lifestyle, introduced her to illegal substances, and forced her into illicit work. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that while he may have sold her the boyfriend line, I'm thinking he was something else entirely. Police initially wondered if this quote-unquote boyfriend could be tied to Rebecca's death, given his criminal background and violent behavior. However, after investigation, he was ruled out as a direct suspect, as there was no evidence placing him at the scene. He also didn't fit the description of either of the men who were described by Antonio in the frantic call to the cops. Even so, detectives believe that his criminal activities indirectly set the stage for Rebecca's slaying. One theory is that this man may have angered dangerous individuals in the local drug underworld, and that Rebecca ultimately paid the price for his actions. In other words, Rebecca might have been targeted in retaliation for someone else's wrongdoing. With Rebecca's identity confirmed and her background uncovered, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office pressed forward to find her killers. They had scant physical evidence from the crime scene, so detectives focused on leads from the 911 call and the streets of Belle Glade. Antonio, the eyewitness, had provided a few critical details. One perpetrator's nickname, Ricardito, the description of 2 Hispanic males, and the blue Ford Bronco with a partial license plate containing 7 and 2. Police checked records for vehicles matching the description and canvassed local informants for any mention of someone named Ricardito. Unfortunately, the nickname didn't immediately match any known suspects in the area. A breakthrough hint surfaced about 3 weeks after the slaying. On May 14, 1991, the Sheriff's Department detained a local man who had allegedly told a lady of the night that he had slain a woman who met Rebecca's description recently. Disturbingly, this wasn't told to her as some sort of direct threat, but rather as some sort of chilling boast about what he had allegedly done. This individual, whose name has never been released publicly, became a prime person of interest. Detectives located him driving a blue vehicle and used a traffic stop as a pretext to bring him in for questioning. The situation grew even more suspicious when, before investigators even mentioned any further crimes, the man blurted out that he knew they wanted to talk to him about a slaying. This unsolicited statement raised red flags, as it suggested he was aware of Rebecca's case or had a guilty conscience. Detectives attempted to interview the man, but the suspect quickly invoked his right to an attorney and refused to answer questions. Lacking any hard evidence tying him to the crime, the police had no choice but to release him from custody. Despite the setback, investigators remained convinced that this unnamed individual was involved. With the investigation stalling, law enforcement's best hope was to find the one person who saw everything, the mysterious caller known only as Antonio. Detectives launched an all-out search for this Good Samaritan witness, emphasizing that he was not in any trouble and could hold the key to solving the case. Little is known about Antonio beyond the brief call he made. He told the 911 dispatcher that he was using a payphone because he had no phone at home. This suggested he might have been from a poorer community or was working as a migrant laborer, and perhaps may have been in the United States illegally. From his accent and language, police believe Antonio is likely Cuban. Unfortunately, despite numerous calls for Antonio to come forward, he has never resurfaced. Unsurprisingly, it hasn't been all that easy to locate a Cuban guy in Miami named Antonio, at least, not the correct one. Decades have now passed since Rebecca Young's life was viciously cut short, and there's been little in the way of progress. Her family and the community have never forgotten the quiet young woman who fell victim to such a cruel fate. At present, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office continues to treat the case as an active and ongoing investigation, despite the fact that the case has gone cold. Personally, I think that the key to the case is the so-called boyfriend. I suspect he knows exactly who did it and why. In the early morning of April 29, 1965, Captain Charles Shelton bailed out of his stricken reconnaissance jet over Laos and parachuted into the unknown. It was his 33rd birthday, but instead of celebrating with his family, he spent those hours evading enemy search parties in the jungle below. Shelton could not have known that day would mark the beginning of a decades-long mystery, one that would see him become the last official U.S. prisoner of war of the Vietnam era. His disappearance sparked a decades-long quest for answers and remains one of the Vietnam era's most haunting mysteries. Charles was an Air Force pilot on a top-secret reconnaissance mission when fate struck. He had been flying an RF-101C Voodoo jet over northern Laos, gathering intelligence in a conflict the U.S. was not officially acknowledging. To maintain secrecy, he wore a sanitized uniform with no identifying insignia, thus keeping plausible deniability. On April 29, 1965, hostile ground fire hit Shelton's plane. He managed to eject safely, radio his location to friendly forces, and land by parachute in rugged enemy-held terrain. Rescue helicopters scrambled to reach him, but monsoon clouds and mountainous jungle forced them to turn back empty-handed. They wouldn't abandon this man by any means, but the risk was simply too great that further casualties would be sustained if they didn't wait out the torrential rains. Back home, at the very same time, his wife Marion had been preparing a small birthday celebration in her husband's absence when the awful news arrived. And keep Marion's name in mind here, because she's someone who quite literally went to hell and back to get answers about what happened to her husband. For a few days, search teams scoured the jungle without success. Then, about 6 days after the crash, word reached the Air Force that a downed American pilot had been captured by communist Pathet Lao forces. Villagers in the remote region reported seeing an American pilot dragged off into the jungle, confirming that Charles Shelton was alive but now a prisoner. These forces that took him were known for their extreme brutality, making the situation more concerning than it already had been. The Air Force soon forwarded Marion some of Charles's personal effects, including his dog tags and military ID card. These items would normally have stayed with a pilot, so their return implied he was captured and had been relieved of his identification by the enemy. Being captured was only the beginning of Shelton's ordeal. Over the years, sporadic reports trickled out of Laos about an American captive who matched Shelton's description. Fellow prisoners of war repatriated from Vietnam told of a resilient pilot still being held in Laos. Importantly, these accounts were largely secondhand in nature, simply things they had heard through the grapevine while being held prisoner. One particularly harrowing account described an American kept in a bamboo cage or underground pit, defying his captors at every turn. Shelton's family heard that he had attempted escape multiple times, and even that he fought back ferociously during interrogations. According to one story, he managed to overpower several guards, an act of bravery that led his captors to label him incorrigible and possibly retaliate with lethal force. Such accounts were impossible to verify, but they kept alive a glimmer of hope alongside the gnawing fear of what he might be suffering. Back home in Kentucky, the Shelton family refused to let Charles become just another name on the growing list of missing servicemen. His wife Marion and their 5 children held on to hope through years of silence. When the American involvement in Vietnam drew to a close in early 1973, they anticipated that Charles might finally come home. President Nixon announced that all American prisoners would be released, and lists were published naming those returning and those who had perished in captivity. But then something disturbing happened. Marion's heart sank when she saw Charles's name listed among the dead. Officially, the U.S. government asserted that no POWs remained alive in Southeast Asia after 1973, but Marion was unconvinced. She became one of the strongest advocates not just for her own husband, but for all the men who were still potentially lost or captive. Determined to find any trace of her husband, Marion embarked on a bold journey into the war-torn region where Charles had vanished. In mid-1973, against State Department advice, she secretly traveled to Laos, a country then controlled by communist forces, to search for clues. Accompanied by a journalist ally, she met with villagers and shadowy informants who claimed an American pilot was being held in a cave in the mountains. Though she found no concrete evidence, Marion's resolve only grew. Even after returning home empty-handed, she continued to chase every lead. Reports from refugees and declassified documents hinted that some U.S. airmen were still alive years after the conflict. In one document obtained via the Freedom of Information Act, a source claimed that Charles Shelton had been seen alive as late as 1983, nearly 2 decades after his capture. These whispers of survival fueled Marion's quest and made her an outspoken advocate in the national movement to return these men home. After decades of fruitless searches and unfulfilled promises, the emotional toll on the Shelton family was immense. By the late 1980s, Marion's relentless fight had consumed her life and health. She made impassioned public appeals and appeared on television to keep the issue alive. But behind the scenes, she fell into despair and substances. In 1980, a Pentagon board moved to declare Charles dead, but Marion successfully appealed. In 1984, the Air Force Secretary personally intervened to keep Shelton listed as a POW, the only Vietnam-era serviceman still officially not presumed dead. This decision was a symbolic victory, but also a constant reminder that her husband was still missing. The unresolved loss eventually became too much for Marion to bear, and sadly, on October 4, 1990, she lost her battle with the depressive results of losing Charles. In the aftermath of Marion's death, the 5 Shelton children sought to finally bring closure to a saga that had defined and consumed their family. They petitioned the Air Force to change their father's status once and for all. On September 20th, 1994, the U.S. Air Force officially declared Colonel Charles Shelton killed in action. The following month, a memorial service with full military honors was held at Arlington National Cemetery, where his name was inscribed on the same headstone as Marion's. High-ranking officers, including the Air Force Chief of Staff, attended to pay respects to a man who had become a symbol of all the missing American soldiers in the conflict. Ultimately, the mystery of his fate remains unknown, but it does appear that he survived at least for some time in captivity. Many historians believe that he most likely succumbed to brutal treatment at the hands of his captors. What is certain is that Shelton's story gave a very public face to all the servicemen who were missing and never accounted for in Southeast Asia. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to 2 of your friends or family members that appreciate mysteries of all kinds. Also, feel free to check out the YouTube membership and the Patreon to support my content creation further. Imagine a city built almost entirely of wood, from its homes and shops to the sidewalks underfoot. Now picture that city after a rainless summer, its timbers dry as tinder, when a spark hits at exactly the wrong place. In October 1871, that spark found Chicago, and within hours an inferno engulfed the metropolis. By the time the flames died out, a third of the city lay in ruins, and 100,000 people were left homeless. The Great Chicago Fire remains one of the most infamous urban disasters, a catastrophe so dramatic that its true story is often obscured by myth drilled into us in school as fact. On the night of Sunday, October 8, 1871, a fire began in a barn on the city's southwest side. The blaze likely started around 8:30 p.m., and within minutes it was out of control, fueled by dry fodder and driven by a fierce southwest wind toward the heart of the city. Initial firefighting efforts were hampered by exhaustion and confusion. The city's 185 firefighters had been battling blazes for days, and a reporting error sent crews to the wrong location at first. Meanwhile, flames raced through densely built wooden neighborhoods, leaping the Chicago River and igniting the downtown business district. By Monday morning, chaos ruled as residents fled for their lives. Many ran as far east as they could, onto the Lake Michigan shoreline, and even waded into the water to escape the relentless flames. Heat and updrafts spawned fire whirls, tornadoes of flame that lifted burning debris high into the sky. Blazing embers rained down to spark new fires, even leaping the river when some landed on a railroad car carrying kerosene on the far side. The fire roared northward through the night, consuming almost everything in its path in an unrelenting wall of flame. Early on October 10th, nature lent a hand. A much-needed rain began to fall, helping extinguish the last flames. By the time it was over, the fire had raged for 30 hours, killing an estimated 300 people and reducing 3.3 square miles of the city to ash. Some 17,000 buildings were destroyed, causing $200 million in damage and leaving 1 in 3 residents homeless, as entire neighborhoods vanished. Large portions of Chicago were now a smoldering wasteland of charred rubble and chimneys, as far as the eye could see. The exact cause of the Great Chicago Fire was never officially determined, though there is, of course, a story I assume the vast majority of you are already familiar with as historical fact. Popular legend blames a cow in Catherine O'Leary's barn, kicking over a lantern and starting the blaze. Mrs. O'Leary denied this story, and historians have cast doubt on the cow and lantern tale. It was an easy scapegoat, but no evidence ever proved the cow story true. Other theories suggest a neighbor's accident, or even a falling meteor could have sparked the blaze. In fact, other devastating fires erupted that same night around Lake Michigan, lending some credence to the meteor theory. Some scientists believe that this debris could have sparked a trail of fires when combined with the dry conditions. In truth, all we know is that the fire likely began in or around the O'Leary barn that night. Whether through human carelessness, bovine negligence, or a celestial object, a small flame caught hold and found perfect conditions to explode into a firestorm. Chicago in 1871 was a disaster waiting to happen. More than 2/3 of its structures were made of wood. Roofs were often covered in tar or wooden shingles, and even the sidewalks and roads were made of wood. After a nearly 3-month drought, the city was tinder dry. The day before, firefighters had battled a large blaze that left them exhausted and their equipment damaged. When the O'Leary barn ignited, Chicago's overtaxed firefighters were slow to respond due to confusion and faulty alarms. Under these conditions, even quote-unquote fireproof brick and stone buildings eventually ignited as their interiors baked from the extreme heat. It was a perfect storm of drought, wind, wooden buildings, and human error that conspired to turn a small barn fire into a citywide cataclysm for the ages. In the immediate aftermath, stunned survivors wandered through the ruins as authorities struggled to maintain order. Reports of looting forced officials to summon militias, and martial law was declared for weeks. Relief efforts began at once. Aid poured in from across the country and overseas to help the 100,000 displaced residents. The British sent assistance. A donation from England helped establish Chicago's first free public library as a symbol of the city's rebirth. Fortunately, key infrastructure such as railroads and stockyards lay outside the burn zone and continued to function, so the city's economic lifeline survived to fuel the recovery. Rebuilding began immediately. Within weeks, Chicago elected a new mayor who pushed for stricter building codes and fire safety measures. The city soon passed regulations requiring fireproof materials, spurring a shift from wood to brick and stone in new construction. Chicago's population grew from about 324,000 before the fire to nearly 1 million by 1890. In the following decades, Chicago became a center of architectural innovation, giving rise to some of the world's first modern skyscrapers. Despite the horror of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire forged an enduring legacy of resilience. Its memory is woven into the city's identity, and one of the 4 stars on Chicago's flag commemorates the fire. The cow story may have become folklore around the nation and internationally, but in a 1997 twist, the city officially exonerated Catherine O'Leary and her cow from blame. In the harsh expanse of the Colorado Desert in southeastern California, a set of giant figures lies etched into the earth, visible almost only from the sky. These are the Blythe intaglios, enormous geoglyphs near the town of Blythe, California, not far from the Colorado River on the border with Arizona. Intaglios are a form of rock-based art, generally practiced by pre-modern humans, often for unknown reasons. Modern awareness of these figures dates to 1932, when a pilot flying between Blythe and Las Vegas noticed unusual shapes on the desert surface. His discovery prompted a survey by the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles that same year. While local indigenous peoples likely knew of these sacred sites, non-native people had overlooked them for centuries due to their grand scale and ground-level obscurity. The intaglios are situated on 2 low desert mesas about 15 miles north of Blythe, just west of US Highway 95. This remote location kept them hidden from outsiders until the age of aviation. The Blythe intaglios consist of 6 large figures arranged in 3 groups across the desert floor. In total, there are 3 human figures, 2 animal figures, and 1 spiral design. They were created by scraping aside the dark surface stones to reveal lighter sand and soil beneath, a method similar to that used for the much more famous Nazca lines in Peru. The removed stones were piled along the edges of the designs, and the exposed ground was compacted. This technique has helped the figures endure by inhibiting plant growth on the lines. The largest of the human figures is an awe-inspiring 170 feet long from head to toe. The smallest human figure is about 100 feet long. Each human is rendered in a simple form, a torso deeply dug into the earth with outstretched arms and legs that are more shallowly etched. The animal shapes are more abstract, with some observers thinking they resemble horses, though others interpret them as mountain lions. Keep this horse theory in mind as we go forward, because American prehistory buffs will know that horses vanished in the Americas long ago. One figure is a coiled spiral about 30 feet across, believed by some to represent a snake. Scattered around the intaglios are also geometric alignments in large circles. One circular clearing, roughly 140 feet in diameter, is believed to have been a dance area, perhaps used for ritual gatherings. These gigantic designs are virtually imperceptible from ground level, and to a person walking among them, they just seem like random patches of bare soil amid gravel. Much like the Nazca lines, it's only from high above that the intentional shapes emerge. The creation of these figures required coordination and effort, suggesting they held great meaning for their makers. Mystery surrounds the questions of who made the Blythe intaglios and why. Mainstream archaeologists haven't reached consensus on their exact age or function. No organic material was directly left in the designs to allow straightforward carbon dating, but some attempts to date them through indirect means have been made. Radiocarbon dating of nearby sediment and artifacts has yielded a broad range of dates from as early as 900 BC up to around 1200 AD. This suggests the intaglios could be as much as 2,000 to 3,000 years old, though their true age remains uncertain. Some scholars believe they were created by the ancestors of today's Mojave and Quechan tribes, who still inhabit the region. That said, they don't appear to have any oral histories related to claiming the Blythe intaglios as their own creations, putting this theory in question, though I'll come back to this shortly. Others have hypothesized much older dates. According to this claim, if the animal figures really depict horses, they might date back to the end of the last ice age when native wild horses roamed this region. However, others take the horse narrative and drastically swing the other way. They instead propose that the formations were made after the reintroduction of the animal to the region. It's believed that by the middle of the 16th century, horses had gradually been reintroduced to the region. Because no known texts or direct oral histories definitively explain the Blythe geoglyphs, researchers have proposed various theories about their purpose. Many believe these giant drawings had ceremonial or religious significance. The presence of the large circle or dance ring and other patterned alignments suggests gatherings or rituals took place on these sites. One line of thought is that the figures were intended as part of ceremonial processions or pilgrimages, for example, stops along a long ritual journey. Others believe that the figures represent events from the cosmology of the people in the region, and may be intended to be viewed by a spiritual personification of the sky, or a sky god. Thus, the reason why the figures don't appear to be anything on the ground is because they simply aren't meant to be viewed by humans, but rather by some form of divinity. Still others have proposed that the figures serve an astrological or astronomical purpose, though the meaning hasn't been meaningfully decoded. What all researchers and theorists can agree on is that these intaglios were not mere doodles or idle artwork. The labor required to produce figures of this scale indicates a deliberate intention, likely rooted in the spiritual or social life of the culture that made them. Although the true originators of the Blythe intaglios cannot be named with certainty, the native peoples of the region do have their own understanding of these giants on the ground. According to Mojave tradition, the human figures represent Mastamo, the creator of all life. In Mojave belief, Mastamo is a central figure who formed the Colorado River and taught the people how to live. The animal figures, in turn, are said to represent mountain lion siblings who assisted Mastamo in the creation of the world. These interpretations align with the idea that the geoglyphs depict characters from the tribe's creation stories, essentially marking the very landscape with the presence of their deities. Yet, interestingly, no tribe today claims human authorship of the Blythe intaglios. There's a sense that these figures have simply always been there, placed long ago by powerful forces or ancient people now forgotten.